Now that my screens are set up, I want to go ahead and I want to make sure that the rig is going to respond in a predictable way. So what I'll do is my first order of business after setting up my desk is I'm going to actually step through my rig one system at a time and make sure that it's doing everything that I expect. And that's making sure that the lights point in the right direction when I tilt them up, making sure that I can get them all to do the same thing simultaneously. Taking the time early to configure your rig to respond as you expect may seem like a waste of time early on, but that little bit of time investment at the beginning is going to pay dividends later when we start moving into building our focus palettes and really quickly needing to work with these fixtures. So how I'll do it is I'll step through one group of lights at a time and make sure that they're responding accordingly. So for example, if I was to grab my first group of spots and I tilt them up, they're going the way that I expect. You will, over time, as you work with moving lights, figure out ways that you like the lights to move. I always, for example, like when I move the encoder to the right, I want those lights to tilt up as I would expect them to. Right? When I move my tilt encoder to the left, I want the lights to point down. When I move my pan encoder to the right, I want them to pan lamp right. When I move my pan encoder to the left, I want them to pan lamp left. I want that on every group of fixtures so I can really quickly grab a group of fixtures and instantly know what the light's going to do when I grab it. So part of my early ringing out the rig is ensuring that these lights are responding in a predictable way. So I'll go through and I'm going to grab my first group of spots and I'm going to move my encoder to the right and they're tilting up. Great, that's exactly what I want. I'm going to now grab my second group of lights, tilt them up. They're moving correctly. Going to move my encoder to the right. They're panning lamp right. Wonderful. And I'm going to do that for each group. Here I have my truss 4 spots. If I move my encoder to the right, I notice that they're actually tilting down. They're tilting backwards from what I expect. So I need to go into patch and I need to invert this tilt. So I'm going to open my patch screen. And I'm going to, because I just had that group of lights selected, I'm just going to hit select last and repopulate that selection. If I'm just walking up to a rig for the first time, I may not offhand know all of the numbers, and because my groups are laid out geographically, I may not know the group number. So if I find a problem spot, I'm going to take care of it right away. I'm going to jump into patch, and I can just hit select last, and whatever my last group of lights that were the problem child were, I'm instantly going to select them. And then I can just come into the attributes for those fixtures, and I can invert tilt. And now when I go back into live, I can see that as I tilt them up, they're tilting up, and as I move the encoder to the left, they're tilting down. There's another issue with these lights. This rig is laid out in a series of concentric V's that are about 15, the V's are 30 degrees, so each light is offset about 15 degrees. This is a cool look. However, it's going to be inconsistent depending on which groups of lights that I want to work with. I want predictability when I grab a moving light. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to reorient these lights in their home position to make sure that when I tilt them up, they tilt straight. This way I could grab the whole rig from a home position and tilt it up, and all the beams are going to be coming straight out to the audience. So typically the way that I'll do that is I'll use one light as kind of a test pattern, and then I can duplicate that all to all the other fixtures. So if I hit enter and I step through this group, I can grab one light, I can pan it to the left because I know that's going to move it lamp left. And I find where it is looking straight, and that's at 15 degrees. I also happen to know that these are 30 degree off center, so if you know that information, it saves you a lot of time. But okay, so now I'm going to grab that whole group of lights again, and I want to move all of these fixtures to 15 degrees off of their 0 point. Now I could go through and do it one fixture at a time, but that's not terribly time efficient. It's more helpful if I work with these fixtures in large groups and step through them in ways that make sense so I can address more than one light at a time. So here I have 6 fixtures. 3 of them are pointing 15 degrees in one direction, 3 of them are pointing 15 degrees in the other direction. So what I want to do is I want to grab these fixtures, so I'm just going to grab all of those fixtures there. And again, we're in highlight mode, so when I grab those fixtures, they're going to turn on. And now there's 2 fixtures, so if I pan them all, they're all still going to move in the same direction. What I want to do is I want to be able to grab the left 3 lights, pan them negative 15 degrees or to the left, and I want to grab the right group of lights and pan them 15 degrees to the right, or positive 15 degrees. So I'm going to actually use offset to do that. So with that group of lights on my command line, I'm going to go ahead and choose offset, number of groups, 2, because there are 2 groups of lights that I want to move. And now I can use the next key, and I'm only going to talk to half of that. And if I hit next again, I'm going to talk to the other half. So I can go ahead and use next. I can press on my pan encoder. If I'm on an ion or a geo or an EOS, I have the button in the middle that I can push. I can also choose that from my parameter tiles here in my CIA if I'd like to. And I know I need to move those negative 15 degrees. So I've put my pan on the command line, minus 15. It's going to move them. Next, I need to move these 15 degrees to the right, plus 15. And now when I select these, they're all pointing perfectly straight. To manage this data and make sure that the lights are always pointing in the direction that I expect them to when I home them or send them to their default values, I'm going to use a custom home preset. I like using preset 9999, but a lot of programmers have something different. It's completely up to you what preset you use. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the displays key, and I'm going to open setup. And under the system settings, right here in the middle, I have something that says home preset. And if I tap in that, I can define what preset I want to use. And this is just a bucket that I'm putting this information that I want to be the default values for these fixtures in. And then it's going to reference that when I send these lights home. So I'm going to type in 9999 for my home preset. And now I'm going to go back into live. So now I want to go ahead and I want to record these values as my home preset. But before I do that, there's one more thing that I want to do. With these lights on, I'm going to tap on the tilt encoder or select it from my parameter tiles, and I'm going to type in 45 degrees. The reason is, when I turn all these lights on in their home preset, I want them to look like something somewhat interesting. So if I at least tilt all the lights out towards the audience at 45 degrees, it looks like something as opposed to a mistake where all of the lights are pointing down in case something accidentally doesn't get recorded or there's a hole somewhere. At least I'm not totally up a creek. They're doing something. It also, the fixtures, if they're not on and you look up at the rig, they look a little more purposeful if they're pointed up at 45 degrees rather than pointing down like they don't know what they're supposed to do. So now I've got this data as manual in my live table. So I'm going to only record the manual values because I don't want any of the other stuff recorded into my home preset. Record only, preset 9999. And that's going to record those values into my home preset. So now you'll see that it populates with the name of the preset in my live table. And now if I sneak that out, you see that my home values here, as opposed to being 0, are actually set to negative 15 degrees with a 45 degree tilt. I have uninverted this tilt. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab those fixtures. And you can see that, once again, they're pointing in the wrong direction because we set our home position to be a 45 degree tilt, but now it's 45 degrees in the wrong direction because our tilt is opposite what we expect. When I turn my encoder to the left here, they're tilting out, not when I turn them right. So before I went in, I went into patch and I inverted the tilt, but because this is a function I'm going to be doing over and over again, I'm going to record it as a macro. My general rule is if I'm doing something more than twice, I'm going to macrotize it to save myself some time. And as I know that all these lights in the rig are hung in the same orientation, I might as well macrotize this early on so that I can save time as I'm going along. So to record this macro, I'm going to select the macro that I want to record. That's why I keep this bank of macros below my live table here, so I can have quick access to what I need. I see that macro 14 is available, so I'm going to say learn 14, enter, and it's now learning. It's flashing 14. So, and now I just provide the action that I want the macro to do. So I want to go into patch. I want to select my last group, which is group 23, and then I want to invert the tilt. And then I want to go back into live. And now I'm going to hit learn again, and it's going to stop recording the macro. So now when I turn these lights on, instead of pointing upstage, they're pointing downstage, and they tilt in the way that I expect. Of course, my next thing I'm going to do is label this macro, because you should always label everything. That's a great rule in programming writ large, but particularly when you're busking, because we're not referencing group numbers, and there's no organizational structure outside of what's laid out on the desk. So I need to be able to look at something in a list and tell exactly what it's going to do. So I'm going to open my macro editor, select macro 14, and hit the label key. And I'm going to call this invert tilt. So now, as I'm going through my rig, if I grab another series of these, and I go ahead and I just hit my invert tilt macro, it's going to actually just invert that tilt for me, and I don't have to go into blind and do it all manually. I want to invert it back, hit invert tilt again, and it's going to invert it. So it's actually going to patch and doing that action for me, so I can really quickly step through this and make these changes all over the rig as I encounter these problems, not one at a time, by going to patch. So after I've got my rig all configured how I want it, and I make sure that everything is moving as I expect, the next thing I want to do is I want to make the desk work for me. By default in the new show file, there are a bunch of default EOS settings that are not necessarily conducive to busking, or at least I don't find them conducive to busking. So I'm going to go in there and I'm going to change them right at the beginning so I'm not fighting them all throughout this setup process. So I'm going to again hit the displays key and I'm going to go into setup. And there are a couple places that I want to make changes. One place that I want to make changes is in my queue settings. By default, EOS gives us 5-second queue times for all of our queue timings. I typically probably won't want a gobo to roll in 5 seconds. I want it to snap in. So I prefer to set all of these to 0. That way, I know when I record a new cue list and play it back, something's going to happen instantly. And then I can apply timing if I want. For example, my focus cue lists, I may want a timing of 2 seconds. However, some of my other things I may not. I could also come in here and set my focus to have a default time of 2 seconds. That way I know anytime I'm making a list that contains a focus parameter, it's going to automatically happen in 2 seconds and everything else is going to happen in 0 seconds. It just depends on how you like to work. The key here is when I make something, I know exactly what it's going to do. And by running through these settings, even if you don't change anything, by running through them when you first approach a desk, it gives you confidence that when I run this list or when I record this list and play it back, I know exactly what's going to happen. Another change that I'm going to make is in the manual control. I want to make sure that all of my manual timings are 0. If I do want to have a dynamic control of manual timing, I'll use a manual timing master, which is a fader state, rather than changing it here. Because I want to be able to change this on the fly. I don't want my manual values to necessarily be tied down to something in settings. Also, when I'm programming this, I don't want to wait 5 seconds for my lights to fade up. I want them to just happen because I need to slam through this before the band comes on stage. The big things I change in here are my sneak time, my go to queue time, and my standard back time. I always set my sneak time to 0. I don't need my sneak time to be sexy. I don't need it to fade on. I want to do something, and if I want to get that value off stage because I don't want it recorded into something, I don't want to wait for it to fade out. I just want it to turn off. Because again, the programming isn't for me, or isn't for a designer or the audience. Programming time is my time, and I don't care how slick the light turns on or turns off. I just want it to go away. I'll also set my go to queue time and my back times to be set to queue. So to do that, if I select on my go to queue time where I would normally type something like 5, if I select that and type queue instead, it's going to use the queue time of whatever queue I'm going to. I will do the same for back time. So what this allows me to do is if I have a 2 queue list, maybe it's rolling a gobo in and out, and I'm going forward to roll it in and back to roll it out, I don't want it to snap in and then slowly rate out in 5 seconds. I want whatever I set for that queue timing to be, I want to go into that queue in that timing regardless of where I'm coming to it from, which is why I'm always going to set my go to queue and my back time to be queue, because that way when I go to this queue, I know what it's going to do, predictability. I don't want if I go backwards it to have one timing and if I go forwards it to have another timing. I'll also change my assert, off, and release times. We're going to use off and release a lot when busking. It's how I return values that are coming out of playbacks to their background state. This is a global change. I tend to like this to take 1 second. 1 second is enough for it to look intentional, but fast enough for it to be useful to a beat or for a quick reset, turnaround between songs or something like that. So before I leave setup, there's one more change that I want to make. I'm going to go into my record defaults and I'm going to change my mode from tracking to queue only. Tracking is great for straight theater because it allows me to make one change and have it echo show wide if I need it to. But the non-sequential nature of busking and setting up a busking show file is more conducive to using a queue only model.